I just said to Sylvia that we'll have to wait the mandatory 10 minutes for bank staff to arrive at a meeting which is scheduled to start on the hour. But I think we'll start now. I'm very happy. I'm Jeni Klugman from the Gender Group. I'm very happy to welcome you to our session on gender at work, addressing constraints to women's jobs. We've got a terrific panel here this afternoon to address what I think you all agree is a very important and timely topic. I was just going to say a few words by way of introduction and then turn to our panel. We've structured this in a way which will be very lively and interactive and also allow for audience participation. So start jotting down kind of your questions and points as you're stimulated to do so during the course of the conversation. Just by way of introduction, looking around the room, I don't think I need to say too much. I just wanted to kind of firmly put on the table the persistence and the reality of the gender gaps which continue to exist in the world of work in terms of employment rates. Even labour force participation globally has remained pretty close to stagnant over the past 30 years. Beyond participation, we know that there are major gaps in terms of earnings, where women work, in terms of occupations and so on. We do see some decline in gender pay gaps, but again, very persistent. We know that the enterprises that women run tend to be less profitable, that they tend to have less access to capital. And then we also know that, of course, the glass ceiling is very persistent. And that's one of the areas in which Sylvia has worked, that women are much less represented, well represented among senior job levels. And there's some recent figures in this area as well. And then finally, and certainly not least, is that women tend to predominate in parts of the economy which are less well represented and less well regulated, in particular domestic work, informal work, and in agriculture. And at this juncture, we have both the gender and the jobs WDRs, which I think have done a really nice job in terms of laying out the importance of work, the intrinsic value of, if you like, good jobs. And we can see that, for example, coming out of the Gallup data as being a very strong predictor of people's kind of subjective well-being and happiness. We also know that there are very important economic payoffs, and there are a whole range of studies which have documented the potential payoffs. A recent Goldman Sachs one makes some estimates about the gains in terms of GDP. There's recent work on the bank side from Latin America which estimated the extent to which rising labour force participation in that region had contributed to poverty reduction. I think it was around 30% of the total reduction in poverty could be attributed to increasing labour force participation over 2 decades or so. So the session we're having today, Gender at Work, also happens to be the title, the working title of a report we're working on at present. It will be a companion report to the Jobs WDR, and it'll inform the work that we're doing on that report. So we very much welcome the conversations that'll take place today. And what we're going to try and do in this report is to bring together the analytical frameworks that we'll put forth in the 2 WDRs and focus in particular on the policy and operational implications of the insights which are provided. And we're hoping to, or planning to launch this report in the summer. One thing that's already very clear is the importance of kind of thinking about and recognising the multiplicity of constraints which exist, that they're not necessarily only in the most obvious places. There may be very important underlying constraints in terms of home responsibilities, reproductive health and autonomy, exposure to violence inside and outside of the home. And what we're hoping to do in this report, or planning to do in this report, is to look at kind of promising programs as well that have sought to address these constraints. What we're going to do today is to try and better understand how these pervasive constraints operate in different contexts, and again, what the policy implications are. We're going to highlight where they've been addressed in innovative ways and important implications for the bank and the bank's work. So now I'd like to turn to introduce our panel. Dr. Sylvia AnnHewlett may be known to a number of you. She's an economist and founding president of the Centre for Talent Innovation, which is a non-profit think tank involves a task force of more than 75 global companies focusing on realising talent in the global marketplace. She's also co-director of the Women's Leadership Program at Columbia Business School. She has a long CV, which we very impressive achievements, both in terms of the academic world, but I think also, very importantly, bringing some of these issues into kind of popular discussion and public discourse. Some of you may have heard her most recently on NPR and coverage in the New York Times, among other places. Louise Fox, I think probably requires no introduction, but I'll introduce her in any case. She's known to many of us as the lead economist in the Africa region at the World Bank. She's done a lot of pioneering work on gender in the labour context, as well as in poverty and inequality and other dimensions. Recently, she's been working on the nano enterprise sector in Africa and the importance of household enterprises and how they work. She's done a whole range of really important, I think, and influential country economic and sector work, which has helped us, as well as worked on various flagship regional programs. So thanks, Louise. And then finally, and not least, Dr. Namita Datta is a senior monitoring evaluation specialist at the IFC, the International Finance Corporation, works on development impact. She was a core member of the job study team that was carried out by the IFC, which I guess itself was a companion also to the jobs WDR, and is working now on developing measures of development effectiveness with respect to the work on labour by the IFC. She's worked with SIGA as well as with SDN at the World Bank. And it's great that you can join us as well. So let me turn now to kind of open up. I mean, basically what we were going to do was start with the kind of broad kind of contributions to the conversation from each of the panellists, because each of you, Sylvia, Louise, and Namita, have observed gender gaps in the world of work in your own research, but your own research has actually been quite varied, I think, in the way that you've tackled these issues. You've observed that gaps in labour force participation, in terms of earnings and occupations, in really quite diverse contexts. So what I wanted to do for the audience here was to allow you just to set the frame a bit for the conversation and tell us about the key obstacles that you've seen. And we'll go maybe Sylvia, Louise and Namita, and we'll reverse the order at various times. Sylvia.
Thank you, Jeni. It's such a pleasure to be here today and honoured to be on this panel. Let me start with what I feel is actually some good news. Over the last 5 years, I've done quite a bit of work on college-educated women in the emerging markets. This is no longer a tiny sliver. In some countries, it's as much as 20%. In others, it's more like 13%, but it's not 2%. And increasingly, whether you're talking, Brazil, India, China, Malaysia, Indonesia, for instance, you will find that women are outperforming men in tertiary education. It's obviously quite different at the secondary level, which is fascinating, but at the tertiary level, women are doing very well. In Brazil, for instance, there's 62% of college graduates and 70% of graduates in the life sciences. In China, if you take the top business schools, females are now 65% of graduates. So like here and in Europe, women are doing very well at that level. What this translates into is a ton of very accomplished women in the lower ranks of management, in government, in not-for-profits, in the private sector. And because growth rates are really impressive in many of these countries, these women are actually doing better than us. For instance, in India, women are now 11% of CEOs of the biggest companies. The same is true in Brazil. Here, they're barely 4%. And what you find is that there are two big differences say in India and Brazil, two countries that I've spent a lot of time in recently. First off, women themselves are fiercely ambitious. They are part of a very special moment in these nations. They want to help transform their countries. Another amazing thing is that they're not nearly as impeded by childcare burdens as women back in Europe or North America. The combination of extended family and inexpensive household help means that they take very short breaks. In India, we just did a study this spring. The average amount of time that a woman takes out of a career is merely 11 months. Here it's 3.1 years. And we know that breaks from employment is generally the kiss of death in terms of cumulative earning power. So I would say that the unexpected news is that management in terms of the presence of women is looking remarkably good. But what does this mean? And I guess I put two thoughts out there. It doesn't mean that there's something inevitable about continued progress. For instance, elder care is a Mack truck coming down the highway. And in China and in much of Asia, it's much easier to subcontract your child than subcontract your mother-in-law. And women feel that they're going to get profoundly derailed by elder care. It's also true that international experience is oftentimes the route to a truly senior slot. And women, again, are neither being tapped on the shoulder nor find it's possible to, experience that kind of leg up in terms of their career. And, one of my hunches is that you're not going to have a whole lot of women at the center of power until we figure that out. And finally, I just want to say something about the economic consequences of having a ton of women in decision-making roles. Some brand new work that we're in the midst of that's going to be published in September is called Innovation, Diversity, and the Bottom Line. And what this work does is it unlock in a lot of concrete ways precisely how the power of difference at the top is a tremendous generator of innovation and growth. And I'll just end with an actual example. Standard Chartered Bank, which is all over India, finally has some women at the top. What does that mean? Well, there's one woman. Her name is Rarashtree Nambiar. She is the head of branch banking throughout India for Standard Chartered. And she had this fabulous idea that women in India, particularly go-getting professional women, are very badly served by the banking system. There's tremendous condescension coming out of male Indian bankers, maybe male bankers, period. And she felt that they always wanted to talk to her son or her husband or her father, not to her, because they don't believe that she really has decision-making power. So she went to her executive committee, and because she has clout, she was able to persuade them to open a bunch of branches in India, which are staffed only by women, from the security guards to the lead financial advisors. And not only did she totally transform how they rendered services. There was a total makeover. They offered babysitting and coffee and who knows what else, and spa packages and a diva club if you moved your balance there. But they transformed the products they were offering, and they particularly targeted small female entrepreneurs. At the end of last year, these were the most profitable bank branches in Asia. And this is a model that's spreading. And there's a whole ton of less affluent women who are benefiting from this. So what I would like to see is more of a feedback loop from the newly successful female executive in these economies and the broader plight of women in these countries. So I'll hand over.
Great, thanks, Sylvia. I think that'll really get us thinking. But Louise, I think you're looking possibly at the other end of the market in Africa. But let us know.
Well, most of my work has indeed focused on, I must say, the other end of the market. But it's good to hear these success stories. I guess it'll be another 4 some years before we get to find out what happens, or more, before we find out what happens at the World Bank if a woman were at the top and we had innovation. But in the meantime, back to Africa, where at least I can say that the man that we have at the top is certainly concerned with what's going on there. I think what I would say for women in the labor force in Africa is we observe a number of gender gaps. And I would start with the education gap. About 5 or 6 years ago, or 7, maybe 7 or 8 years ago, when I was starting to do a study on education reform in Mozambique, and I wanted to see whether the reforms, how they'd affected girls going to school and finishing school versus boys. I was told the gender issue had been solved. Well, the good news or the bad news is it wasn't solved, and the good news is we now know that. And since education so strongly determines opportunities for anyone in sub-Saharan Africa, the problem of gender gaps in opportunities really starts there. Now, it's true that in urban areas, the women and men, girls and boys go to school pretty much equally. But in rural areas, we still have a big gap, which we just haven't solved. And the girls don't start school on time, and that means they don't finish. In post-primary, so in secondary and tertiary, where it costs more money, the gender gap also kicks in. So then if you think about 3 sectors, 3 broad sectors, types of employment, you have wage employment, you have self-employment in non-farm enterprises, or what I call household enterprises, and you have agriculture. You know, if you want a job in the modern wage sector, you've really got to have some secondary education. And so what we see is that conditional in education, females will have an equal chance of getting into that sector. The problem is really that they're not getting the education chance. But in terms of the sort of informal wage labor types of jobs, women tend not to be in those sectors because those are kind of day labor jobs, which are basically physical labor. Within the wage sector, women do tend disproportionately to go into the public sector, maybe it's because they get a better chance. But what happens is you see more women in agriculture. That may be partly as a result of not having the education to move into the non-farm sector, but also in general in rural households, the tendency is for the man to sort of go into the non-farm sector first. And there are a number of reasons for that. Higher fertility in the rural areas, so women are looking after the kid. They also tend to be the ones that take responsibility for the food security of the household, so they are likely to be in agriculture. Now, within those 3 broad types, we also see occupational segregation, which I know we're going to talk about in a minute. But there is the well-known issue in some countries, but not every country, of women's crops and men's crops. And there are issues of women's access to land. There's issues of everybody's access to land, but inheritance rules, of course, may not favor women. Within the household enterprise sector, at the national level, there seems to be broad participation of females. But there are issues of what sector you enter. And so females tend to enter some of the lower paying sectors, tailoring and dressmaking and food preparation, while you see men in some of the higher paying metalwork, repair work, and whatever. And even within the trading sector, you often see men engaged in selling more higher value items. Jobs within the trading sector that require more travel, you'll find more men in. And then in the wage sector, there's some, it's somewhat idiosyncratic. As usual, you don't see women, for example, in the mining sector. I would mention two more gender gaps that I think are important. One is the gender gap in aspirations. And I think if you were at the session on youth employment in Africa this morning, Marcus Goldstein talked about that, and this Brock program and some other programs that are trying to address it. Patty Pettish is here. The qualitative work that she did clearly showed a gender gap in aspirations. And if you have a gender gap in aspirations, you're going to have a gender gap in outcomes. And I guess that's what you were saying, is there doesn't seem to be a gender gap in aspirations, so you didn't, among the highly educated women. But among the less educated women, there's clearly a gender gap in aspirations. And that's why targeted programs and targeted efforts are so important. And there's just a whole lot of buzz going around about how to break this gender gap in aspirations. And I think, but I just want to put that on the table. And the second one is that all of the evidence suggests that whatever work you do, females face fairly constant requests, demands, pressure for sexual favors and threat of sexual harassment. And I think that that's sort of the soft underbelly of women's work in sub-Saharan Africa. So I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Louise. I think we'll be returning to a number of these issues, including around segregation, as you already mentioned. But Namita, do you want to open up for us?
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Jeni. So last year, aligned with the WTR, the IFC launched the IFC job study. And the reason we did that is because the private sector, 90% of jobs in the developing world are in the private sector. So if we are to in any way meaningfully address this whole challenge of job creation, we cannot but focus on the private sector. So what we wanted to do, what IFC wanted to do with the study, was to really look at our own experience with our private sector clients, also look at the experience of our clients in different parts of the world, in different sectors, and try and see what is really this link between what the private sector does and the jobs that are created. And to the extent possible, we also wanted to quantify some of these effects. What we found, not surprisingly, is that the private sector across the world faces a number of, especially the developing world, faces a number of very severe constraints. And those are constraints to, starting a business, but also growing to your fullest potential. But interestingly, in all these constraints, we find that women, if it's a women-owned entrepreneur or a women-owned or managed firm, these constraints are that much more severe. So while these constraints vary across the globe, broadly, we looked at four key constraints. What are these constraints? So number one, investment climate. Now, this is where you really talk about the absolute fundamentals. So there are two challenges here. The first, that men and women are still unequal in the eyes of law in a large number of countries. I mean, whether it's to do with property rights or inheritance laws, the Women Business and Law finds that 102 out of 141 countries, there is at least one legal disparity between men and women that affects women's economic capacity. And wherever the number of legal disparities are higher, you find that the percentage of female participation in the labor force is lower. So this is really, really critical. But even if the laws are gender neutral, you can still have gender biased outcomes. I mean, that is really, really important. So just take, for example, the laws and procedures that govern how you register a business. So it's common knowledge that in the developing world, some of these procedures are cumbersome, they are lengthy, and they're expensive, and they impose a lot of cost on the private sector. But this cost is that much higher for women. So one of the reasons, of course, is because women have other demands on their time, but also, and this was mentioned by Louise as well, but also women are perceived as softer targets for corruption. So there's a study in India that finds that women on an average wait 37% longer just to see the same government official. Or that 16% women, when they go to register their business, they are sexually harassed by government officials. There's a study in MENA that says that in almost eight or nine countries, I think, that women are simply unable to even enter the office of the business registrar if they're not accompanied by a male relative. So this is really, we're really talking about fundamentals here, and men and women are not equal. Second constraint that we discussed in our report was access to infrastructure. Now, this is huge, especially for low-income countries. Power is a huge issue. In South Asia, for example, 11% of sales are lost just because of power outages. And this is sort of a regional average. But if you look at a country like Nepal, it's 27% that's lost because of power outages. So just imagine a quarter of a country's production is just lost because of power. Now, this price of inadequate power and inadequate infrastructure is much more severe for women because it takes away their time that they could have spent. Women have to spend much more time getting water and firewood in rural areas, and this very time could have been spent going to school or doing an income-earning activity. So an impact evaluation in South Africa showed that in rural villages, after rural electrification project, female employment went up by 13.5%, simply because now women had more time to follow an income-earning activity. Let's take access for finance, a third key constraint. Now, female-owned firms, there's a study that quantifies it, says that they are 5% less likely to have access to formal credit. And even where they do get credit, even where they do get financing, they pay a premium. They pay a higher rate of interest just because they're owned or managed by women. And I think a study quantified it by 0.5% more just because you're owned or managed by a woman. In Indonesia, there are 60%, 60% of the formal and informal firms are owned by women, but a number of women entrepreneurs are denied credit without their husband's permission. Or in MENA, banks, for example, would not let you file a loan application unless your husband co-signs it, even if your husband has no financial resources of his own or is not interested in your business. A wife cannot file a loan application without her husband's signature on the application. The last constraint that we looked at in the AFRCE job study was skills and training. And even here, Louise mentioned, of course, that there's a huge skills gap which comes from an education gap. And this affects women's ability to participate in sectors that are typically high-paying. So we looked at all of these constraints in the job study. And in each one of them, we found that women are much more disadvantaged. We'll come to some of these issues, I guess, as we go along. But I'll stop here.
Great, thanks, Namita. I wanted now to go back to Louise again to explore this issue of occupational segregation a bit more, because I think that the WDR kind of emphasised this as an important source of gender wage or gender earnings gaps, bringing together evidence from around the world. And I think that you've found similar kind of concentrations in the work that you've been doing on household enterprises, which are particularly important in Africa. So you can talk a little bit about kind of the patterns that you see and what's causing it?
Sure. Occupational segregation is a very old problem, and it persists today. And I think we need to focus on when and why it's important. I remember finding out 10 years ago, I'm not sure if this is still true today, but 10 years ago, actually, according to these measures of gender concentration, Sweden had much more occupational segregation than the US. And I thought, wow, this is supposed to be really equitable country, whatever. And then I started asking about it, and I realized why nobody talked about it in Sweden. It's because women's jobs didn't pay less than men's jobs. teachers actually got paid a decent salary. So it wasn't such a big deal. And so I think the reason why we care about occupational segregation, I would say first and foremost, is about opportunity and the opportunity to make a living and make the most of your skills and contribute. Now, I think that there really is a problem in sub-Saharan Africa. And so there clearly are, in the area that I've been working on with household enterprises, there are female sectors and male sectors. Now, why does this happen? Well, first of all, as I mentioned, norms are really important. Both people thinking of what they can do and what's acceptable for them to do, and what, if you're a young, so you finish primary education at say 13, 14, what your parents think you ought to do is still, you know, pretty important. And if you sort of went and told your father you'd like to be a car mechanic, and the way to be a car mechanic was to have a 2-year apprenticeship in an area where there are a bunch of people who repair cars, 99% male, and your co-apprentices are teenage guys. And it's common for the apprentices actually to even sleep there at the lot at night to guard the cars. Your father's going to say no. As a matter of fact, if it was your daughter, you'd probably say no too, for good reason. So, you know, it's norms, it's how things are structured. And although the traditional apprenticeship and the traditional informal training things are really how many people enter this sector, it's been known for a long time that they can be a real avenue for persistent occupational segregation. And that's why it's, breaking into a new area can be dangerous for females, and that's why it's important